Welcome to the Boxing Gossip channel. Please hit subscribe if you are new. Callum Smith advances to the final of the World Boxing Super Series, where he will supposedly be facing George Groves if Groves can recover from the injury that he sustained to his shoulder against Chris Eubank Jr. Tonight, Callum Smith wins a unanimous decision against Nieky Holzken. Two of the judges had it 9 rounds to 3. One of them had it 10 rounds to 2. I kind of thought 10 rounds to 2 was probably a fair representation of what happened in the ring. Callum Smith, much bigger man than his opponent, much rangier guy from his opponent, started the fight well, trying to box from range, trying to get his jab going. Holzken, walking forward, very, very fit, very, very durable opponent. You know, at no point in this fight did he look like he was going to get hurt or going to get put out of there at any point by Callum Smith, even though he ate some pretty good shots. And he kept trying to walk forward, trying to bridge the gap, and trying to counter Callum Smith with levels of success at varying points of the fight. Holzken probably lacked the boxing fundamentals and technique of Callum Smith. So he'd kind of try and walk into range and then put together flurries, you know, combinations of left, rights. Sometimes they were slappy, sometimes they were wide, but he had moments of effectiveness in the fight, even though he never had Callum Smith bothered. For Holzken, as we know, he was a late notice opponent in this fight after Jürgen Bremer withdrew with flu. So Nieky Holzken took the fight on 5 days' notice. It was his first 12-round fight. And it was the biggest stage that he's fought on by far. My understanding is he was due to fight on the undercard against Dmitry Chudinov, so a very, very different kind of opponent to Callum Smith. You know, Callum Smith we think of as a tall, long-range, rangy boxer. Chudinov, short, stocky, come-forward guy, with not using the jab so much, more using pressure and mid to inside game. So a very, very different opponent for Holzken to what he was preparing for at very short notice, and a huge step up in class. I predicted Callum Smith to win the fight, obviously, and a few people commented, that Holzken was a bit of an unknown, and that he could potentially be overlooked in the fight. But if you actually looked at the opponents that Holzken had been in with previously, they were at such a low standard. They had such poor records that this was a truly, truly astronomical step up in class for Holzken. And to be honest, he performed with some real credit in the fight. He showed great fitness, great durability, great heart, and some elements of his boxing game were decent. Actually, I thought his timing of counter punches was quite good. Some of the work when he was able to close down the range was adequate, and he gave Callum Smith a few things to worry about. Callum Smith, on the other hand, I thought he started the fight very well. Got the jab pumping, that left-hand lead, pretty instantaneously. That was a factor in this fight throughout. He was throwing the right cross off the left jab, as you'd expect. As we know with Callum Smith, he's someone who can drop left and right hooks into the body quite nicely, which he was doing with good effect in the early part of the fight. I also thought he was using the uppercut very, very well in the fight. He landed notably with the uppercut probably 10 times over the course of the fight. And although he couldn't wobble his opponent with it, they were decent, hard punches delivered with accuracy. And, most times Smith threw that shot, he landed with it. And that's something I give Callum Smith credit for. He's someone who's a long-range boxer. He's probably at his best when he's using the jab cross from range. But he's got a few other strings to his bow. And, those hooks to the body, that shortened uppercut up the middle, some decent punches to have to his arsenal. Later on in the fight, Joe Gallagher asked him how his hands were doing, and Smith seemed to indicate that he was carrying an injury to both hands, which is a potentially worrying thing as he goes into the final of this tournament. Be interested to hear a little bit more about that, and be interested to hear, just how much damage, how much injury there is to those two hands. But Smith certainly in the corner seemed to be indicating that that was potentially a problem. Maybe that was affecting his power in the fight. As is always the way with Callum Smith, I was a little bit concerned with him defensively. He sometimes has a tendency to be quite tall, quite upright, and maybe be slightly vulnerable to fighters who can time him and counter him. And I thought his opponent tonight, Holzken, did a very, very good job of punching with Callum Smith. Sometimes if Callum Smith threw out a lazy jab or a lazy cross, Holzken would kind of read it, make it miss, and then throw a right-hand overhand punch just straight over the shot that Callum Smith had stuck out. And I noticed Holzken do that with success on 3 or 4 times over the course of the fight, landing fairly flush on Callum Smith. And it was a little bit of a concern for me, that Nieky Holzken was able to find that type of punch. If he's landing it, you wonder whether George Groves will be able to find punches like that and land with much greater power and much greater snap in the final. Holzken, whilst he showed a lot to get credit for this fight, unfortunately this is a fight that when we look back on it in a year or two's time, it'll be Callum Smith versus the late notice kickboxer. That's how boxing fans are going to remember this fight. And for me, there were still moments, whilst Callum Smith had a relatively comfortable time in there were still moments that Callum Smith gave us reasons for doubt. There was 1 or 2 times he looked a little bit less comfortable when Holzken was able to step in on him and bring the work to the inside. I think the tendency to be caught when he was trying to exchange was a little bit worrying. And you've got to wonder with Callum Smith, at this stage of his career, the best opponent he's beaten is probably the likes of Rocky Fielding, Christopher Brasse, that sort of type of level. Eric Skoglund asked some real questions of Callum Smith in the first round. Skoglund had real success with the jab. We saw Holzken tonight have some success with timing him and bringing the fight to the inside. Sometimes there's just a little bit of a suggestion that Callum Smith may be a tiny bit defensively frail and someone who is not the most at ease and not the most comfortable in there when he's under pressure and when the bullets are flying. And that's a test that he's probably going to have to face in the World Boxing Super Series, so we'll have to see if he can raise his game to that level. But all in all, despite 1 or 2 moments that suggested more questions will be asked of him at a higher level, all in all, it was a relatively comfortable night's work for Callum Smith tonight. And I don't want to give the impression he put on a bad performance, because he did do, fairly well in there. His jab was good, the uppercut was good, he was disciplined, he looked relatively solid in there, albeit against a much smaller guy, a guy who'd fought at a much lower level, and a guy who'd stepped up to fight in the World Boxing Super Series, at such very late notice. Of course, I have to do a video on the channel as to how I see that final going between George Groves and Callum Smith. What I would say is if George Groves is able to return for the final without damage done to him from that shoulder injury, you'd have to make George Groves a favourite. Obviously, Groves has performed at a much higher level in the ring. My suggestion is that Groves is probably a slightly sharper boxer in terms of his speed and his precision. Possibly a bit more to him in terms of movement. And I actually think Groves is a bigger puncher than Callum Smith as well. I know Callum Smith had a real fearsome reputation on the way up through the game as a puncher. But maybe that was, more about the level of opposition he was in with than the actual power he possesses. He is a good body puncher, and that is something that George Groves will have to be mindful of, certainly. But I don't think he's got the same devastating one-punch knockout power that he showed early on in his career as he stepped up through the level. So there you go. I guess Callum Smith has kind of got through to the World Boxing Super Series final by beating Eric Skoglund and Nieky Holzken. And I guess in many ways you could say that he's had a fairly routine run through towards that final. Many people wouldn't be confident that Callum Smith would handle either of the opponents that George Groves has faced on way to the final. So Callum Smith's had a relatively easy journey. He's had 2 tough fights, both of which that have gone late. He's had to answer questions in both of those fights, and now he's potentially got some frailties with his hands. So questions remain over Callum Smith. But he's handled tonight in relatively good fashion. As for Nieky Holzken, he emerges with credit. you know, a lot to be liked about his performance, given that he was preparing for someone with a completely different style, and given what a substantial step up in class this is for him. If he can potentially dedicate himself to boxing rather than kicking people in the head, you know, maybe there's a chance for him to come again in future. Anyway, that's my brief thoughts on this. Let me know your take on this fight. What did you make of it? Leave your comments in the section below. If you've enjoyed the content, please hit the thumbs up button and please subscribe if you haven't already done so. Many thanks for tuning in.